She had learned, somewhere in the space between raising children and burying a husband, that the hardest decisions are often the ones nobody notices you making. Helen Fraser was 79 years old, and she had lived in the same two-story colonial and suburban New Jersey for 42 years. The house had witnessed everything: 3 children growing up, countless birthday parties, her husband's long illness, the gradual quieting that comes when a full house empties. The walls held memories the way old fabric holds scent, invisible but undeniable. The third bedroom upstairs had been many things over the years. First, it was Brian's room, her youngest son, now 51, and living in Seattle with a family of his own. Then it became a guest room, then a sewing room, then just a room where things accumulated. Boxes of Christmas decorations, her husband's golf clubs that nobody wanted to throw away, a treadmill purchased with good intentions and abandoned after 3 determined weeks. Now, on this particular Tuesday morning in late September, Helen stood in the doorway of that third bedroom with her coffee cooling in her hand, looking at the space with new eyes. The morning light came through the window at an angle that suggested autumn was serious about arriving. Dust motes floated in the slant of sun. The room smelled like old carpet and possibility. Her daughter-in-law had called 3 days ago with a request that was really a plea, that was really a crisis barely contained. Helen had listened to the whole story, about childcare falling through, about costs spiraling, about Karen's new job that couldn't be rescheduled, about how they'd tried everything else first, and at the end of it all, a question delivered with apology and hope in equal measure. Would Helen consider watching her grandson 3 days a week, just for a few months, just until they figured something else out? The grandson was Tyler. He was 4 years old. Helen's son, Marcus, and his wife, Karen, lived 20 minutes away, close enough to make this possible, but far enough that it would reshape Helen's entire routine. Helen hadn't answered right away. She'd said she needed to think about it, which had clearly surprised Karen, who'd probably expected an immediate yes. Grandmothers were supposed to jump at chances to spend time with grandchildren, after all. That was the script. But Helen had lived long enough to know that scripts didn't account for complexity. She'd spent those 3 days turning the question over in her mind the way you might examine a stone, looking for rough edges, testing its weight. On the surface, the answer seemed obvious. Of course she'd help her son. Of course she'd spend time with her grandson. What else did she have to do? She was retired, widowed, living alone in a house too big for one person. But underneath that surface, other truths waited. Helen valued her routine. She woke at 7, made coffee, read the newspaper front to back. She spent mornings in her garden during good weather, tending roses that required constant attention. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, she volunteered at the library, shelving books and helping with the literacy program. Wednesday morning, she had coffee with 2 friends from her book club. Fridays, she drove to the grocery store, always the same one, always with a list. It was a quiet life. Some might call it small, but it was hers, built carefully over the 8 years since Martin died, constructed specifically to hold her without overwhelming her. A 4-year-old 3 days a week would demolish that careful construction. There were other considerations, too, ones she felt guilty even thinking about. She was 79. Her energy wasn't what it used to be. 4-year-olds were tornadoes of need and noise and constant motion. Could she keep up? What about her back that complained if she bent too much? Her hearing that sometimes missed words in crowded rooms? What if something happened to Tyler while he was in her care? But the thought that troubled her most, the one she kept circling back to, was this: what if saying yes erased the boundary she'd worked so hard to establish? Helen had 3 children. Marcus was the middle one, the one who'd stayed closest geographically and emotionally. Her oldest, Sharon, called once a month from California and visited every other Christmas. Brian, the youngest, sent thoughtful texts and remembered her birthday, but lived his own life 3 time zones away. After Martin died, there'd been a period where her children tried to absorb her into their lives. Invitations to move closer, suggestions about assisted living communities, conversations about what she needed. All of it well-meaning, all of it suffocating. Helen had fought quietly for her independence. She'd insisted she was fine alone. She'd established patterns that proved she could manage. She'd set boundaries, gentle ones but real, around how much help she needed and how often she wanted company. It had taken years to achieve this equilibrium. Her children had slowly accepted that she meant what she said, that she was capable, that she wanted solitude, not rescue. And now here was Marcus asking her to blur those boundaries again, not with malice, not with manipulation, just with genuine need. Helen understood genuine need. She'd lived through it herself all those years ago when her own children were small and money was tight, and Martin worked 2 jobs while she stretched every dollar until it screamed. She remembered how desperately she needed help and how rarely it had come. But she also understood that saying yes to everything meant saying no to yourself. And at 79, how many years of yourself did you have left to sacrifice? The 3rd bedroom waited for her decision. Helen set down her coffee and walked into the room, her footsteps creaking on the old floorboards. She moved boxes aside, uncovering the carpet underneath, beige and worn, but serviceable. The walls needed painting. The closet was full of things that should have been donated years ago. If she said yes, this room would need to become something else, a play space, a nap area, somewhere Tyler could be safe and occupied while she tried to maintain some semblance of her routine. She tried to imagine it, toys on the floor, children's books on the shelf, the sound of small feet running down the hallway. The questions. 4-year-olds ask approximately 1 million questions per hour, or so it seemed. The meal she'd need to prepare, the vigilance required to keep a child safe. And underneath all of that practical consideration, another question. Did she want this? Not should she, not was it the right thing to do, but did she, Helen Fraser, 79 years old and finally comfortable in her solitude, want to fill her house with a child's presence 3 days a week? She didn't know, and that uncertainty felt like failure somehow, like she was supposed to be beyond such selfishness by now. Helen had been raised in a generation that didn't celebrate questioning duty. You did what needed doing. You helped family. You sacrificed without counting the cost because that's what women did, what mothers did, what decent people did. But Helen had lived long enough to see what constant sacrifice created. She'd watched her own mother disappear into service, becoming so identified with what others needed that when those needs finally ended, there was nothing left of the woman underneath. Helen had promised herself she wouldn't do that. When Martin died and the initial grief lifted enough to think clearly, she'd made a conscious choice. She would build a life, not just fill time. She would have routines and interests and boundaries. She would matter to herself, not just to others. It had felt revolutionary at 71. It still felt necessary at 79. But now Marcus needed her. Karen needed her. Tyler, though he didn't know it yet, needed her. And Helen stood in the 3rd bedroom, caught between the person she'd worked to become and the person she'd been raised to be. She called Marcus that evening, not to give an answer, but to ask questions. What would the schedule look like exactly? What happened if Helen got sick? What if Tyler got sick? Would they provide meals, or would Helen need to figure out lunch 3 days a week? What about activities? Would they expect Helen to take him places, or could she keep him home? What if it wasn't working? Could they revisit the arrangement? Marcus answered everything patiently. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Drop off at 8, pick up by 5:30. They'd provide food and supplies, no expectation of outings unless Helen wanted to, and yes, of course, they could adjust if needed. He sounded relieved that she was asking questions, like questions meant yes was coming. Helen didn't correct that assumption. She said she'd let him know by the weekend. After she hung up, she sat in her living room as the September evening darkened outside. The house was so quiet. It had taken her years to stop hearing that quiet as loneliness, to start hearing it as peace. Would she miss this quiet, or had she maybe had enough of it? On Wednesday morning, Helen met her friends for coffee as usual. Nancy and Patricia, both in their 70s, both widowed, both navigating the strange territory of late life with varying degrees of grace. Helen didn't mention the decision she was weighing, but somehow the conversation turned to grandchildren anyway. Nancy was complaining about her daughter expecting free babysitting every weekend. Patricia was worrying that she didn't see her grandkids enough, that they were growing up without really knowing her. "It's impossible to get it right," said Nancy, stirring sugar into her coffee with more force than necessary. "You help too much, you're interfering. You don't help enough, you're selfish. There's no winning." "I think the trick is knowing what you can give without resenting it," said Patricia quietly. "My sister watched her grandkids full-time for years, thought she was being helpful, but she was miserable, and eventually everyone could feel it. It poisoned everything." Helen absorbed this, turning it over alongside her own thoughts. "Do you think there's anything wrong with saying no, even to family, even if they really need help?" Nancy looked at her sharply. "What's going on?" So Helen explained, the request, the uncertainty, the guilt about even hesitating. "Of course you should help," Nancy said immediately. "He's your grandson. Your son needs you. And what else are you doing that's so important?" But Patricia shook her head. "That's not fair, Nancy. Helen has a life. Just because she's not working doesn't mean her time doesn't matter." "I didn't say it doesn't matter. I just said family comes first." "Does it, though? Always, no matter what?" They argued good-naturedly for a few minutes, neither convincing the other, until Helen laughed and said she should have known better than to ask advice from two people who never agreed on anything. But later, driving home, she thought about Patricia's question. Did family always come first? She'd lived most of her life believing that, but somewhere in her 70s she'd started to wonder if that belief had cost her more than it had given. Her own mother had died at 63, exhausted. That's what the death certificate said, heart failure, but Helen thought exhaustion was closer to the truth. Her mother had spent her entire life in service, to her husband, to her 6 children, to her church, to every neighbor who needed help. She'd been beloved and worn out in equal measure. At the funeral, people had told stories about her mother's generosity, her willingness to help, her selflessness. And Helen had stood there thinking, but who was she? Underneath all that service, who was my mother as a person? She'd never gotten to know the answer. Maybe her mother hadn't known it either. Helen had promised herself then, at 35 and still young enough to change course, that she would not disappear. That she would be a good mother and wife, yes, but also a person with interests and opinions and boundaries. It had been harder than she expected to keep that promise. The world pushed back against women who claimed space for themselves. But she'd tried.
She'd kept small things just for herself, her garden, her books, her Tuesday mornings at the library. And now, at 79, those small things felt like the architecture of her selfhood, the proof that she existed beyond what she could do for others. Was she willing to dismantle that architecture, even partially? Thursday afternoon, Helen drove to Marcus's house. Karen had texted asking if she wanted to come over for dinner. Nothing formal, just a chance to see Tyler and talk in person. Helen recognized the strategy. It was harder to say no when you were looking at the people asking, harder still when a 4-year-old was hugging your legs and calling you grandma. But she went anyway, because avoiding the situation wouldn't make the decision easier. Tyler met her at the door, all energy and uncombed hair and a superhero cape tied around his neck. He shouted grandma like she was a celebrity, and Helen felt her heart do that thing it did around children, softening and opening despite her better judgment. Dinner was chaotic in the way that households with young children always were. Tyler spilled his milk, argued about eating vegetables, demanded 3 different stories at bedtime. Marcus looked tired. Karen looked tireder. They kept exchanging glances that Helen recognized, the silent communication of partners in survival mode. After Tyler was finally asleep, the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table with coffee. The house was quieter now, but the evidence of chaos remained. Toys scattered, dishes piled in the sink, someone's jacket on the floor. "I know this is a lot to ask," Karen said, her hands wrapped around her mug. "We wouldn't ask if we had other options. The daycare wait list is 6 months long, and we can't afford a full-time nanny. And my job, I can't turn down this position. It's the promotion I've been working toward for 5 years." "I'm not saying no," Helen said carefully. "I'm just trying to make sure I can do this well if I say yes." "You'd be amazing," Marcus said. "Tyler already loves you, and you raised 3 children. You know what you're doing." Helen thought about how to explain that knowing what you're doing and having the energy to do it were different things at 79. How to explain that she'd already raised her children and maybe didn't want to do it again, even part-time. How to explain that she'd built a life that mattered to her and was terrified of losing it. But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she asked more practical questions about backup plans if she got sick, about what happened when school started next year, about whether they'd considered other options long-term. They talked for an hour. Marcus and Karen answered everything honestly. They weren't trying to entrap her. They were genuinely struggling, genuinely hoping she could help. Finally, she said she'd give them an answer by Saturday. Driving home, she felt the weight of other people's needs settling on her shoulders. It was a familiar weight. She'd carried it for most of her life. She'd thought she'd finally set it down. Friday morning, Helen worked in her garden. The roses needed deadheading before winter. It was meditative work, repetitive, requiring attention but not thought, leaving her mind free to wander.
She thought about Tyler, about his small hands and constant questions, and the way he'd hugged her goodbye last night, about how fast childhood went, how quickly 4 became 14, became 40, about how if she said no, she'd miss these years of his life. They'd still see each other at holidays and birthdays, but it wouldn't be the same as spending full days together, building the kind of relationship that came from routine and proximity. She thought about Marcus, her middle child, the one who'd always been steady and responsible, and maybe a little too quick to sacrifice his own needs for others. He learned that from her, probably, from watching her be endlessly available. Was it hypocritical to withhold now what she'd modeled then? She thought about herself, about the life she'd carefully constructed, about her mornings with coffee and newspaper, her afternoons at the library, her quiet evenings with books and music and no one needing anything from her, about how fiercely she'd fought for this peace and how quickly it could disappear. The garden didn't offer answers, but the work itself, the cutting back, the clearing away, the preparation for winter, felt instructive somehow. Sometimes you had to prune to promote growth. Sometimes you had to clear space before you could plant something new. Helen just wasn't sure if she wanted to plant something new or if she was finally content with the garden she had. She made her decision Friday evening, sitting in Martin's old chair in the living room. It was the chair where he'd read the paper every night, where he'd fallen asleep watching baseball, where he'd sat during his illness when the stairs became too much. Helen didn't usually sit in this chair. It felt too much like inhabiting someone else's space. But tonight she wanted Martin's perspective, or at least the memory of it. Martin had been a generous man, quick to help neighbors, to lend tools, to spend his weekends fixing other people's problems. But he'd also been clear about his limits. He'd say no when he needed to, without guilt or lengthy explanations. Just, I can't do that. Sorry. Helen had always admired that in him. She'd never quite learned to do it herself. What would Martin say about this situation? She tried to imagine it. Probably something practical and kind and slightly irreverent. Something like, they'll figure it out either way. The question is whether you want to be part of the figuring. Did she want to be part of it? Helen sat with that question as the room darkened around her. She didn't turn on lights. She just sat in Martin's chair and watched her familiar living room fade into shadow and emerge again as her eyes adjusted. And somewhere in that sitting, in that quiet, the answer became clear. Not because it was easy or obvious, but because she finally let herself hear what she'd known all along. She called Marcus Saturday morning. I'll do it, but with some conditions. She could hear the relief in his voice, the beginning of gratitude, but she kept talking before he could launch into thanks. I'll watch Tyler 3 days a week, but I need 1 day's notice if the schedule changes. I can't be on call beyond that. I need to keep my Tuesday and Thursday library volunteering. If I get sick, you need a backup plan immediately. And we revisit this arrangement every 3 months to make sure it's still working for everyone. Of course, yes, all of that is fine. Mom, thank you. You have no idea how much this means. I'm not finished. Marcus went quiet. I'm doing this because I want to help and because I want to spend time with Tyler, but I'm also doing it on my terms. That means I get to decide how we spend our days. If we stay home and do quiet activities, that's my choice. I'm not going to try to be a professional daycare. I'm going to be his grandmother, and that looks how I say it looks. Understood? Understood. Mom, that's perfect. We're not expecting you to be anything other than yourself. Good. Then we start Monday. After she hung up, Helen sat at her kitchen table and waited for the relief or satisfaction or whatever was supposed to come with making a decision. But what she felt instead was uncertainty, mixed with resignation, mixed with something that might have been anticipation if she was being generous. She'd said yes, but she'd said yes on her terms. That felt like something, even if she wasn't sure what yet. Sunday, Helen cleared out the 3rd bedroom. She worked methodically, sorting items into keep, donate, and throw away. Martin's golf clubs finally went to Goodwill. The treadmill got posted online. Someone picked it up Sunday afternoon, grateful. The Christmas decorations went to the basement. By evening, the room was empty except for the basics: carpet, walls, closet, window. a blank space waiting to be filled. Helen ordered supplies online, a small bookshelf, some baskets for toys, a comfortable chair where she could sit and watch Tyler play, nothing expensive or elaborate, just enough to make the space functional. She wasn't trying to transform it into a kid's paradise. She wasn't trying to replicate daycare or create some kind of perfect grandmother experience. She was just making room, literally and figuratively. That night, lying in bed, Helen thought about thresholds, about how many she'd crossed in 79 years, into marriage, into motherhood, into widowhood, and into this strange territory of late life where you're supposed to be wise, but mostly felt uncertain. This felt like another threshold, not as momentous as some, but real nonetheless. She was choosing to let something new into her carefully constructed life, choosing to be inconvenienced and disrupted and needed. She just hoped she wouldn't regret it. Monday morning arrived with autumn sunshine and unseasonable warmth. Helen was up at 6, coffee made, third bedroom ready, herself as prepared as she was going to get. Martin and Karen arrived at 8 exactly, Tyler between them, clutching a stuffed dinosaur and looking uncertain. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said, crouching down to Tyler's level. "Remember, you get to spend the day with Grandma now, just like we talked about." Tyler's lower lip trembled. "But I want to stay with you." Karen's face did that thing parents' faces do when they're trying not to show how gutted they are. "I know, sweetie, but Mommy has to go to work and Daddy has to go to work and Grandma is going to have so much fun with you." Tyler was not convinced. He cried when they tried to leave, big hiccuping sobs that made Marcus hesitate in the doorway and Karen's eyes fill with tears. Helen had seen this before, had lived this with her own children. She knew the only way through was through. "Go," Helen told Marcus firmly. "He'll be fine in 10 minutes. They laughed, though Karen looked back 3 times. Tyler cried harder, reaching for the door. Helen let him cry. She didn't try to distract or cajole. She just sat on the floor at his level and waited. After 5 minutes, the crying downshifted to sniffling. After 7, he looked at her with suspicious, watery eyes. "I don't like this," he announced. "I know." "I want my mommy." "I know. She'll come back at dinner time." "That's too long." "It probably feels that way right now." Tyler considered this. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. "What are we going to do?" Helen smiled. "That's a good question. What would you like to do?" And just like that, the crisis was over. Tyler started talking about dinosaurs, his current obsession, and did Grandma know that the T-Rex couldn't actually run very fast and also had tiny arms, which seemed silly for such a big dinosaur. Helen did not know these things, but she listened as Tyler explained them in elaborate detail, his tears already forgotten, his small body animated with enthusiasm. And something in Helen's chest loosened, just a little, just enough. The first week was hard, not catastrophic, but challenging in the way that disrupted routines always were. Helen's mornings lost their peaceful rhythm. Her house was louder. Her energy was tested in new ways. Tyler was a good kid, but he was 4, which meant he needed constant supervision and frequent intervention. He spilled things, he asked questions without pause. He had opinions about lunch and nap time and what constituted a fair number of episodes of his favorite show. By Wednesday evening, when Marcus picked him up, Helen was exhausted, the kind of tired that went deep into your bones. But Thursday she went to the library as usual, shelved books with familiar efficiency, chatted with the regulars, felt herself settling back into herself. Friday, Tyler came back, this time without tears. He ran into the house like he owned it, shouting about a bird he'd seen on the drive over. They fell into a routine faster than Helen expected. Tyler learned the house rules: gentle with grandma's things, inside voice when possible, vegetables at lunch even though they were gross. Helen learned Tyler's rhythms: how he got cranky if he skipped his nap, how he needed a snack around 3, how he calmed down fastest with dinosaur books. By the end of the second week, something had shifted. It wasn't easy, but it was manageable, and occasionally Helen found herself enjoying it. The third bedroom became Tyler's space, not overtaken by it, but shared with him. His toys lived in baskets that could be hidden in the closet. His books sat on the small shelf. The room could transform, play space during the day, neutral again by evening. Helen liked this fluidity. It felt like a metaphor for what she was learning. You could make room for someone without disappearing. You could be flexible without losing your shape. Tyler started leaving drawings for her, stick figures labeled Grandma and Tyler and Dinosaur in his unsteady handwriting. Helen put them on her refrigerator, surprised by how much pleasure it gave her to see them there. One afternoon in October, they were reading books in the third bedroom when Tyler suddenly looked up at her. "Grandma, do you get lonely?" The question caught her off guard. "Sometimes. Why?" "Because you live by yourself. Mommy says that's lonely." Helen thought about how to answer honestly. "I live by myself, but that's not the same as being lonely. I like having time alone. It's peaceful." "Don't you want someone to talk to?" "I have people to talk to. I have friends, I have your dad and your aunt and uncle, and now I have you 3 days a week." Tyler absorbed this. "But what about the other days?" "The other days I do things I like. I read, I garden, I volunteer at the library. Those things make me happy too." He seemed satisfied with this answer, returning to his book. But the question stayed with Helen. Did she get lonely? She'd been asking herself that for 8 years since Martin died. Sometimes the answer was yes, a fierce, aching yes that hit her at unexpected moments. But most of the time the answer was no, or at least not lonely enough to trade her solitude for company she didn't want. Now, though, with Tyler in her house 3 days a week, she was discovering a different answer. She'd been lonely in ways she hadn't recognized, for purpose, for being needed, for mattering in immediate, tangible ways. But she'd also been right to protect her solitude, because the other 4 days, when Tyler wasn't there, she still needed that space to be just hers. It wasn't either or, it was both, and that felt like something worth knowing. November came with its gray skies and early darkness. Thanksgiving approached. Marcus invited Helen to their house for dinner, along with Karen's parents and her brother's family. Helen almost said no automatically. Big family gatherings exhausted her these days. But then Tyler asked if she was coming, with such hopeful expectation in his face, and she found herself saying yes. The dinner was chaotic. Too many people in too small a space, children running everywhere, adults talking over each other. Helen's hearing aids picked up every sound, creating an overwhelming wall of noise that made her head ache. But there were good moments, too. Tyler sitting on her lap during dessert, sticky with pie. Marcus catching her eye across the table and smiling. Karen's mother complimenting Helen's contribution to the meal, Helen's famous cranberry relish, which she'd almost decided not to make this year. Driving home that evening, Helen felt tired but not depleted, full but not overwhelmed, like she'd found a balance she hadn't known to look for. By December, the arrangement had settled into normalcy. Tyler knew the routine. Helen had adjusted her life to accommodate his presence without erasing her own needs. They'd found a rhythm that worked. One Monday morning, Tyler arrived with a cold, sniffling and cranky, wanting his mother but stuck with his grandma. Helen made him tea with honey, let him watch more TV than usual, read him stories until he fell asleep on the couch. She sat beside him while he slept, his small body curled against her side, and felt a fierce protectiveness she hadn't expected to feel again.
This child who disrupted her peace had also given her something she forgot she needed, purpose beyond herself. When Marcus picked him up that evening, Tyler didn't want to leave. He clung to Helen, saying, "But I'm sick. I need Grandma." Marcus laughed, prying him loose. "Grandma needs a break from your germs, buddy." After they left, Helen cleaned up the tissues and wiped down surfaces and poured herself a glass of wine. Her house was quiet again, peaceful.
But the quiet felt different now, less like loneliness and more like rest, a pause between notes rather than an ending. Christmas approached. Helen usually spent it quietly, church in the morning, a nice meal for herself, calls with her children. But this year, Marcus asked if she wanted to spend the whole day with them. She said yes, without hesitation, and when Christmas morning arrived, she drove to their house with presents in her trunk and genuine excitement in her chest. Tyler opened her gift first, a set of dinosaur books she'd spent weeks selecting. She shrieked with delight, demanding she read them all immediately. Later, when the chaos of opening presents had settled, Helen found herself in the kitchen with Karen. They were making coffee, moving around each other with the ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. "Thank you," Karen said quietly, "for watching Tyler, for being so flexible, for—" She stopped, her eyes bright. "For saving us. This job, it's been incredible, and I couldn't have taken it without knowing Tyler was with you." Helen felt something catch in her throat. "He's a good kid. He loves you. He talks about Grandma constantly, what Grandma said, what Grandma did, what Grandma taught him about plants." She laughed. "You're his favorite person." Helen didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to explain that Tyler had become important to her, too, that he'd given her something to build her weeks around, that helping had helped her in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I'm glad I could do it," she said finally, and meant it. The weeks became months. Winter softened into spring. Tyler turned 5. The arrangement they'd said was temporary became permanent without anyone officially deciding. Helen's life had changed, but she'd changed with it. She'd learned to protect what mattered while making room for what mattered newly. She'd learned that saying yes didn't mean sacrificing yourself if you said it on your own terms. The third bedroom was Tyler's now, truly, but it was also still hers, both at once, a space that transformed and held multiple purposes, like her life itself. One afternoon in April, sitting in her garden while Tyler examined a beetle with intense fascination, Helen thought about that initial decision, about how hard it had been to say yes, about all the ways she feared losing herself. But she hadn't lost herself, she'd expanded herself, added dimension, become grandmother in a deeper, more textured way while remaining Helen with her boundaries and routines and need for solitude. It wasn't perfect. Some days exhausted her. Some days she resented the intrusion. Some days she missed the simplicity of her solitary life. But most days she was grateful for Tyler's questions and laughter and sticky hands, for feeling needed and useful and connected, for learning that at 79 she was still capable of growth. Tyler looked up from his beetle, grinning. "Grandma, did you know beetles can be lots of different colors?" "I didn't know that. Tell me more." And she listened while he explained beetle facts with the seriousness of a young scientist. The garden needed weeding, but that could wait. The quiet would return tomorrow when Tyler was with his parents. For now, there was this: sunshine and beetles and a child's voice filling the space she feared filling. And it was enough, more than enough. It was exactly right. She'd learned somewhere in the space between saying yes and meaning it that the hardest decisions are often the ones that teach you who you're becoming. Helen Fraser was 79 years old. She lived in a 2-story colonial that held her past and her present, and now pieces of someone else's future. The 3rd bedroom was proof that space could hold more than one purpose, that you could say yes without disappearing, that wisdom sometimes meant knowing when to preserve yourself and when to expand. The house was quieter on Tuesdays and Thursdays and weekends, but the quiet no longer felt like absence. It felt like rhythm, like breathing, like the necessary pause that made the fullness meaningful. And on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, when Tyler's voice filled the rooms and his energy rattled the carefully constructed piece, Helen didn't regret saying yes. She'd been right to hesitate, right to question, right to set her boundaries, but she'd also been right in the end to open the door.